Yeah. The loopholes around ability to pay rent. Look, the whole justification that you have offered for the emergency period, as I said, the emergency period, which this legislation defines, surely exists as long as this House thinks there's an emergency. But you have defined it as relating to the winter, right? That's the way that's why is it limited to November to March then, if it's not to do with the winter? It's clearly, that's the basis on which you've decided the period, which is completely arbitrary in my opinion. But anyway, you've decided that, right? We'd like it for longer, for the duration of the emergency. But given that you've done that, that's clearly linked to the cost of living crisis in your mind, right? And rightly so, because people are pressed with extortionate cost of living increases. So the idea then that somebody who might fall behind with their rent because they're having difficulty paying the extortionate increases in the cost of living, in the cost of heating, the cost of electricity, might be evicted. It's a different matter if it's willful non-payment of rent, but somebody who is just falling behind, right? Non-payment of rent. The legislation should not allow for somebody to be evicted in those circumstances. The overcrowding issue is, again, self-evident, as others have underlined. I mean, it makes even less sense to evict people who are in overcrowded circumstances. I'm sure they don't want to be in overcrowded circumstances, but almost invariably people are in overcrowded situations because they can't find anywhere else affordable to live. So it hardly seems a reasonable option to say, well, I can evict you because there's too many of you in the house. And that's okay. And they're not afforded the protections of the legislation. And finally, for reasons I cannot understand, my Amendment 2 was ruled out of order. I just cannot understand it because it related to the, I asked, I'm not sure if the last knows either, frankly, because I don't see how it's charging the Exchequer, simply seeking to extend the protections of the bill to those who've already got termination dates. How that could be a charge in the Exchequer is beyond me. Right, really, that's just a mystery. So I don't understand how it's out of order, but could the Minister please answer the question? I've asked 3 times now. What are you going to do for people who've already passed their termination date and are overholding? Okay? Could you just answer that question? Are you going to do anything? Or are you going to allow a situation where people who've passed that termination date and are overholding, but have nowhere to go, but have done absolutely nothing wrong, could be evicted? Such as, I mean, Deputy Callan has pointed out an example, the couple I mentioned with their kids in my constituency have lived in the house since the 1950s. They were born there. I'd say they probably paid for the value of that house 2 or 3 times over, and they're being evicted. They've done absolutely nothing wrong. And you didn't answer this either, Minister. You looked as if you were going to answer it for a minute and then you sort of veered off into something else. They're a working family, okay? So they're over the threshold. So the council won't entertain them for emergency accommodation. They won't, not that they want to go to emergency accommodation, right? They won't entertain them for social housing. So will they be entertained for the purchase of the house to prevent them going into homelessness when they're over the threshold? Right? That's what should happen. So I'm asking, what do you do for a couple like that? Right? Why doesn't the bill provisions protect them against eviction, even for the limited period that it's doing for others? And beyond the scope of the bill, I acknowledge, is the question of, if we're going to use the intervening period to start buying houses, which we should, can it not be limited to people who are within the thresholds? Can it be also people who are above the thresholds if they have nowhere else to go?
And
how much above? I mean, well, I mean, the house is not like a mansion. It's a terraced house. I mean, what do you want me to say? It's a terraced house. It's smaller than a lot of council houses, if that's what you're asking.
The only elevation is the only elevation, Deputy McNamara, is the success of this policy. And I suppose when I advocated it here in this House a number of weeks ago, I said that I thought we had reached the point where it would be possible to do it. And I think it's important for us to say that there are legal constraints on this, and the points that were made by Deputy McNamara and by Deputy Boyd Barrett, I suppose, outline the extent of the parameter. But ultimately, what we're doing in this case is that we are siding with the most vulnerable here in the case where we know it's not a zero-sum game. We know there are knock-on effects on landlords. We know there are knock-on impacts in the market, and we are desperately trying on every front in Housing for All to increase supply at every level. With every different tool. And this is one measure which we are doing, and we're doing it on the basis of siding with people who are going to face eviction between now over this winter, in the context of all of that we know is going on in the international climate and domestically. And it is a balance. But we should not ignore the fact that we also, many of us in this House, call for a right to housing to be inserted in the Constitution, and we do that so that we can make more macro interventions, more aggressive interventions in the market, where the right to housing can be balanced the private property rights. And so when the Attorney General advised government, more would be possible in this space. And I look forward to the Commission on Housing bringing forward recommendations on what changes we could make to the Constitution to allow governments to take stronger measures in housing. But opposition do ignore that fact that when they call for a right to housing, and they also call for us to go further in this area, they are being hypocritical. Those two things are not compatible. Those two concepts are not compatible. You want the right to housing inserted so that we can go further, but then equally you criticise when we don't go further. This is a balance, Lascan Corla, and I think we're doing it in the right way.